So the Centre for Family Research is based in Cambridge, as I mentioned, and it's a multidisciplinary centre. We study all kinds of different families, but also we look at, within families, at different processes and ways in which parenting influences child development. So within the centre there are 3 different research teams, and my own particular team focuses on non-traditional families, or what we sometimes call new family forms. And we study different kinds of assisted reproduction family, and today I'm just going to focus, because we're hosted by the Centre for Surrogate Parenting, on our surrogacy studies. So 2 studies. Firstly, a longitudinal study of surrogacy families, and this is a study that's been going on since the new millennium. So these children are now turning 14. And also our longitudinal study of surrogate mothers. So I'll start with the study of surrogacy families first of all. So we set out to do this study to really look at some of the concerns that have been raised sort of many years ago now about surrogacy families, and to look at this and to see really what the empirical evidence told us about whether or not there was any foundation for these concerns or not. So some of the concerns that were voiced about the families were that firstly, in surrogacy there would be no opportunity for mothers, and mothers and fathers as well, to bond with the child prenatally that might have a negative impact on later attachment, that the involvement of a third party may interfere with parenting and particularly perhaps might undermine the confidence of the surrogate mother, that the surrogate mother may remain in contact with the family as the child grows up, and although some people argued that this was a good thing in terms of the child having a better understanding of his or her origins, other people again thought that this might interfere with the parenting of the surrogacy parents. Also, the other issue is that in the wider social world that surrogacy families may be exposed to prejudice, disapproval by friends, family members in the wider community, because they have to explain the arrival of the child. It's not like other forms of assisted reproduction where the parents don't have to be open about the use of donated gametes, for example. And of course, the key question that everybody was asking is, how did the children themselves feel about having been conceived by a surrogate and relinquished to the intended parents? So when we began this study, we were interested really in 4 broad constructs. Firstly, the psychological well-being of the surrogacy parents. Secondly, the quality of relationship between the parents and the child. Thirdly, the psychological development and adjustment of the children. And finally, the relationship between the surrogate mother and the family the surrogate helped to create, and how that relationship develops over time. So the sample included 42 surrogacy families. Now, the numbers aren't large, but they are a fairly representative sample, because in the United Kingdom, where this study took place, all surrogacy births at the point when the surrogacy parents become the legal parents of the child are registered with the Office of National Statistics. And the Office of National Statistics worked with us and approached the parents, asking them to consider taking part in the research. And we also worked with the only UK surrogacy agency at the time, called COTS, Childlessness Overcome Through Surrogacy, to pick up some of the families who hadn't yet become the legal parents of the children. So it was very hard, because of working through these 2 ways, especially with the surrogacy agency, to work out the exact response rate, because it wasn't possible for reasons of how the Office of National Statistics worked to find out exactly how many had been asked and how many didn't, but it was estimated that more than 60% of surrogacy families with a 1-year-old child took part in the research. We then compared the families with two groups. Firstly, a group of 51 egg donation families, and the idea for this comparison group was to control for the experience of infertility and also for the involvement of a third party in the birth of the child. And these families were recruited through fertility clinics, and the participation rate was 75%. The third group was a group of 80 natural conception families who were matched demographically to the surrogacy families and the egg donation families. And these were recruited through maternity wards, and the participation rate here was 73%. So given the kinds of families involved, we know that they were reasonably representative of the populations at the time. So, in terms of the assessments, as I said before, the children were all born in the year 2000, and we obtained in-depth data from several different informants, because often different family members have different views of family relationships. So we had data from mothers, fathers, the children themselves, and also the children's teachers. So the teachers gave an independent assessment of the development and adjustment of the child. The teachers didn't always know that the children were born through surrogacy, so they were told that the children were taking part in a study of different family types. We saw the families when the children were 1, 2, 3, 7, and 10 years old. And we're currently in the middle of going back to visit them again at age 14. So today I'm going to talk about our findings up to age 10. So I won't go into details about the methods, but I'm very happy to answer questions later. But just to say that we used a lot of in-depth interviewing of interviews that were specially designed to assess family relationships. So we were interested in variables such as warmth, emotional involvement, level of interaction with the child, conflict, hostility towards the child, and so on. So these are standardized measures. The interviewers were very well trained to obtain enough information from the parents in order to make codings on these kinds of variables according to a standardized coding manual. And I'm very happy to say more about that later. We also had other people re-rate them to work out reliabilities and so on. So when the children were age 1, the comparisons between the surrogacy families and the natural conception families showed that when there were differences between these two family types, that the surrogacy families obtained more positive scores on the measures. So we found that both mothers and fathers, who we interviewed separately, reported lower levels of stress associated with parenting than the natural conception families. The mothers showed lower levels of depression. The fathers were more satisfied with their role as a parent. The mothers and fathers obtained ratings showing greater warmth and sensitivity towards their infants, and also reported greater enjoyment of parenting. And the mothers and fathers showed higher levels of emotional involvement with the infants. Now that wasn't necessarily a positive finding, but most of them just showed slightly more emotional involvement, although the scale did go up to quite extreme over-involvement, and there were a few families in that category, but this finding was really reflecting just sort of slight levels of greater emotional involvement with the child. When compared, the surrogacy families were compared with the egg donation families. In fact, they were very similar. So the egg donation families looked much more like the surrogacy families than the natural conception families. The egg donation mothers showed higher levels of depression than the surrogacy mothers, but that's not to say they were depressed, it's just that their scores were more similar to the natural conception mothers than the surrogacy mothers, which may well have been to do with the physical consequences of pregnancy. So, for example, higher rates of postnatal depression and so on. So, in levels of depression, the egg donation mothers were more like natural conception, but in everything else, they were very similar in their profiles to the surrogacy mothers. The infants, we had a measure of infant temperament that looked at things like, how easy to soothe the infants were, how difficult they were, and so on. And we found no differences in temperament between the surrogacy infants and either the egg donation or the natural conception infants. So we then went back at age 2. We used a slightly different interview at this point, which some of you may be familiar with, the parent development interview. So this is an interview that was developed in New York by Arietta Slade and colleagues, and it's an interview that's designed to kind of tap underneath the surface of the relationship and look more at the emotional relationship between the mother and the child. So, it assesses positive but also negative feelings and thoughts in relation to the child. So again, a bit like the age 1 assessment, where there were differences, the surrogacy mothers obtained more positive scores than the natural conception mothers. So they had higher scores in terms of pleasure in their children and lower levels of anger, guilt, and disappointment with their children. The fathers didn't differ on this measure, but they did differ in terms of a questionnaire measure of parenting stress, and again showing lower stress. In terms of the comparisons with the egg donation families, again, just as at age 1, the egg donation mothers looked very similar to the surrogacy mothers. And that was also true of the fathers. And again, the fathers showed lower levels of parenting stress. I think I may have said that in the last slide. In terms of the adjustment of the 2-year-olds, we use a measure called the BITSI, which is a fairly long inventory where the parents tick behaviours shown by the child. And we also looked at their cognitive development. And we found no differences in the social, emotional, or cognitive development between the 3 groups of children at age 2. And then again, at age 3, we found that where there were differences between the surrogacy families and the other family types, these reflected again more positive relationships, more positive parenting in the surrogacy families. So a fairly consistent picture over the first 3 years. And the same thing about the egg donation mothers being very similar to the surrogacy. In terms of toddler adjustment, again, this was measured, well, it was measured in 2 ways actually, but mainly by questionnaire, a well-known standardized questionnaire. I think here you use a questionnaire called the CBCL, the Child Behaviour Checklist, that probably many of you are familiar with. In the UK, we have an equivalent called the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire. So it's very like the CBCL. And in terms of strengths and difficulty scores, again, no differences in terms of emotional or behavioural problems shown by the children at age 3. We then had a bit of a gap because of funding, and so that's why we didn't have the age 5. It wasn't for any scientific reason. It was just a funding reason. I should say that actually we had a US funder for the first 3 years of the study, so we were funded by the US National Institutes of Health, and then the Wellcome Trust, no, sorry, that's not true. The Wellcome Trust in the UK funded the first 3 years, and then the National Institutes of Health picked up the study for the age 7 and age 10 assessment, and now actually the Wellcome Trust is funding the age 14 adolescent follow-up. So we've been very grateful to the funders for that. So age 7 is a really interesting time for these children because it's at age 7 that children begin to show a more sophisticated understanding of biological relatedness with parents and also the absence of a biological link with parents. So there's a lot of work, again, I'm sure many of you will know, in the field of adoption, where at age 7 it's really the age at which adopted children, rather than just being able to say they're adopted and born from, you know, someone else's tummy and so on, that they really begin to understand in a more sophisticated way what it means to be adopted and, you know, to have been born to other parents from their adoptive parents and so on. So it's an important transition for children around age 7. So we would expect that with surrogacy, again, this might be quite an important time in terms of children's development and understanding of what it means to have been born through surrogacy. So at age 7, we again interviewed the parents about their relationship with their children, and we looked at positive aspects of parent-child relationship as well as negative aspects. So just talked about variables of positivity and negativity. And also at this stage, we used an observational assessment of mother-child interaction. And what we did was we used a game that you probably know called the Etch-a-Sketch. Yeah, does that? So what it is, it's a drawing task, and it's got 2 dials. And so the mother has control of one dial and the child has control of another dial, and they're asked to draw a house, and they have to cooperate over doing this because one moves vertical lines and the other moves horizontal, vertical, and they have to draw a slopey roof basically, and therefore they have to cooperate to get this straight line. So this is used quite a lot in observational assessments, and there's now been quite a well-developed coding scheme for looking at interaction between parents and children using this task. So in terms of how responsive they are to each other, how well they can cooperate, and so on. So we use this observational measure as well with mothers and children. So what did we find? Firstly, in terms of our interview measures of the quality of mother-child relationships, there were no differences in terms of the amount of positivity in the relationship between the mother and the child. Neither were there differences in terms of the amount of negativity in the relationship between the mother and the child. So that generally, you know, again, these families found to be functioning well at age 7. There was a difference, interestingly, in the observational measure, where both the surrogacy mothers and the egg donation mothers showed less positive interaction than the natural conception mothers. And I'll come back to this in a moment, why this might be. But I mean, I should also say that these were just slight differences. They weren't at all indicative of dysfunctional interaction, but there were some slight differences in the observational measure. So the conclusion from age 7 was that the surrogacy and egg donation families weren't experiencing difficulties, but there were some subtle differences in mother-child interaction at age 7. In terms of the psychological adjustment of the children, we looked at this at age 7 and also age 10. Now, at both ages, the children showed high scores of adjustment that were well within the normal range, both at age 7 and age 10. And this was true of assessments by mothers and also by the children's teachers. So that was important to get an independent view because, you know, you might expect surrogacy mothers want to try and present their children in the best possible light. So having the teachers' independent reports was important. One finding that did come out and that has been quite misreported in the press is that for the mother's ratings at age 7, the surrogacy children had significantly but slightly higher levels of child adjustment problems at age 7. at age 10, so it disappeared. We didn't see it when we went back at age 10. And I think this is a really quite interesting finding, because a very similar thing has been reported in the adoption literature, where 7-year-old adopted children have shown higher levels of problems around age 7, so around this age at which they develop a kind of better understanding of what it means in terms of their biological relationship with their parents. And again, with adopted children, this then declines when they're followed up a few years later. So our findings match very well, particularly the findings of some research, very well-known research group on adoption in the Netherlands, who've reported exactly the same thing. And they explained their finding with adopted children as resulting from adopted children around age 7 having to cope with identity issues earlier in their development than other children. You know, because they're different. Many of the children they studied were sort of from other countries, inter-country adopted children, so they look different from their parents. And that because of this, the children are confronted with issues to do with identity and being adopted earlier than the children in natural conception families, who tend to sort of confront identity issues more as they enter adolescence. And it's quite possible the same is going on with surrogacy children, especially as most of the children, as I'll come to in our study, were in contact with a surrogate mother. They all knew that they were born through surrogacy and so on. So it's quite possible that a similar process was taking place, which may, but this is pure speculation, may have something to do with the observational measure at age 7. But there seems to be something going on at age 7 that then tails off after that. Now, in terms of this research, there are a number of problems with it. Firstly, it is the first, and as far as I'm aware, the only in-depth study of children in surrogacy families that's followed them up longitudinally. So, you know, clearly you can't come to firm conclusions from one study, and you know, hopefully other studies will follow. The disadvantages were the sample size was small. It's possible, as the cooperation rate was just over 60%, it's possible that the families who were having problems were less likely to take part. We just don't know that, because we couldn't go back to the Office of National Statistics and ask any more questions about the families, so we don't know that. Also, we did lose some families over time. But the advantage of the study is that we used very in-depth measures, and we got data from different informants, so mothers, fathers, children, teachers. So we used different methods as well, questionnaires, interviews, observational measures. So it's a very in-depth study. And also, in fact, although we did lose some families, 80% of the families were still participating 10 years later. And I can tell you that for our 14-year-old follow-up, I don't think we're about halfway through that. I don't think we've lost any of the surrogacy families. So the ones who are still in the study seem very committed to it. So, having an 80% cooperation rate, people still in the study at age 10 and age 14, is quite reassuring in terms of what we can conclude. So, what can we conclude? As I said, it's the first study in the world to longitudinal study of parenting and child development in these families. So it's very important that other people carry out similar research to see if our findings are replicated. It's also very important to follow up the children to adolescence and beyond, because we don't know anything yet beyond, well, so far, age 10. But the findings so far are very reassuring. Generally, these families appear to be very well functioning, with very loving, committed parents, and the children themselves show positive psychological well-being. So we didn't pick up any negative outcomes for the children or for the relationships with their parents up to age 10 years. Another issue that people ask about is how does the relationship between the parents and the surrogate play out over time? Because often people assume that this relationship is going to become difficult the older the child gets. So we found with our study that during pregnancy that in fact the intending parents, and particularly the intending mother and the surrogate, generally saw each other regularly and had a good relationship with each other. And most of the mothers, but only some of the fathers, were present at the birth. I don't know if this is a particularly British thing or what happens here, but I'd be interested to find out later. At the time of the child's first birthday, most parents and children had met with the surrogate at least once, and generally were very positive about this relationship, although a few had some mixed feelings, some apprehension about how this relationship might grow or change over time. There were, when they had stopped contact or just had minimal contact, this was either because it was mutually agreed or because the surrogate didn't want it. We didn't come across a single case of the parents stopping contact between the surrogate and the child. So we followed up these families and we asked them about this every time we saw them. So I'll just talk about age 10, which is where we've got to so far. We did find that the frequency of contact between the family and the surrogate decreased over time, and that was particularly true of previously unknown surrogates, because some were friends or family members. But it was particularly true if they hadn't known the surrogate beforehand. But in spite of this tail off, in fact, 10 years later, 60% of the parents remained in contact with the surrogate. And the very large majority reported this as being a very positive relationship. So it didn't seem to be the case that this relationship became fraught, as many people had predicted. And actually, many of them stayed in touch. In terms of openness with the children, so the surrogacy parents were very open with their children about the surrogacy. I think all but one had told their child about the surrogacy by the time they were 7. But interestingly, when genetic surrogacy had been involved, rather than gestational surrogacy, most parents hadn't talked to the child about the use of the surrogate's egg. So the children had been told that they were born through surrogacy, but not that the surrogate was their genetic mother. And by age 10, almost half of the parents still hadn't told the child about the use of the surrogate's egg. So just to give you a quote from one of the mothers I quite like, she said, "We've made it like bread in the oven. She's just kept you warm until you were ready to come out. So no, it hasn't come up that biologically she's not mine." So I think in that quote, it kind of, I like it because it kind of reflects quite succinctly what the mothers were saying to us, that, you know, many of them hadn't talked to the child about the surrogate also being the egg donor. Now, we've also spoken to the children. We did this at age 7 and age 10 to get their views and thoughts and feelings about it. And we found that the children at age 7 had some understanding, but not a great deal of understanding about what surrogacy involved. But by age 10, they did understand it much better. We found that most of the children who were in contact with their surrogates said that they liked her, so they were positive about her and described her with words such as nice and kind. 2/3 of the children wished to see her more often than they did. The rest felt that contact was just about right, and one child wished to see her less. So in fact, in spite of the concerns that had been voiced about the children and being said that they might be distressed by finding out they'd been born through surrogacy, the majority of children at age 7 and 10 either felt neutral or indifferent about having been born through surrogacy. And some of them, but not all of them, understood the relationship, their relationship with the surrogate's own children. So, I'll turn now to surrogate mothers. So this study began really through some of the ethical issues that had been raised about surrogacy from the surrogate mother's point of view that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, but you know, some of those that have been repeatedly raised, questions asked. Is a surrogate in a position to give fully informed consent? Do surrogates regret handing over the baby? Do surrogates experience psychological problems such as depression after being a surrogate? And what is the impact of surrogacy on the surrogate's own family, particularly her partner and her own children? So these were some of the questions we set out to address. I think, again, this is probably the only longitudinal study over many years of surrogates, but if there are others, I would be really pleased to hear about them. This work has been carried out by my colleagues Vasanti Jadva and Susan Imrie at the Centre for Family Research. And they studied 34 surrogate mothers, 20 of whom were seen 1 year after birth, so as part of our original study. And they also interviewed 36 of their children who were aged between 12 and 25 years, so that represented half of the children. Many of the children of the surrogates had left home by the time they followed up the mothers, so the mothers didn't want to ask them to come back often to take part in research, so we only managed to see about half of them. And the mothers and their children were interviewed between 5 and 15 years after the birth of a surrogacy child, so on average the aim was to find surrogates about 10 years later. So the findings of the study challenged the expectation that there would be difficulties in the relationship between the surrogate and the surrogacy family. So really this validated what we were hearing from the parents as well, because we had it from both sides. So 75% of the surrogate mothers had kept in touch with the family and generally saw them once or twice a year. And almost half of the surrogate's own children were in contact with the surrogacy child. There was a lot of variation in how the surrogate's own children saw the surrogacy child. So some of them saw them as half-siblings, and it didn't seem to matter whether the surrogate mother's egg had been used in their conception or not. But I think it was probably about half of them saw the surrogacy child as a half-sibling. Some didn't see the surrogacy child as a relative at all, so not somebody who was of great significance to them. And others created their own terminology to describe the relationship with the surrogacy children. So just a couple of words that were used: sorrow sister and tummy sister, and there were a range of others. So because this was a kind of new relationship, the children came up with their own ways of describing it. And interestingly, in talking to them or their parents, it seemed in drawing a family tree at school, for example, that children, both the surrogacy children and some of the surrogates' own children, actually drew links to each other's family in their family tree. So there were little links, and that came from both sides, which was interesting. So in terms of that study, so following up the surrogates for 10 years, not one surrogate in the study expressed regret about being a surrogate. Many of them maintained a positive relationship with the family they helped create. And in terms of the children, which I think was the first study of surrogacy from the perspective of the surrogate's own children, the children didn't appear to be adversely affected by their mother having been a surrogate. The large majority were in fact positive and proud of their mother. So I'd just like to end this section with a few quotes from the children themselves, just to bring it alive. So this was a child of a surrogate. This child said, "I think it's a really nice thing to do for someone. obviously if they can't have children and they really want a child, that's a bad thing. So if someone else is able to do that for you and help you through it, then it's something that's compassionate, really. And another surrogate's child said, I think it's amazing. It's quite, I don't know, it's like, it's difficult for a woman to give away a child that she's given birth to. And I just think it's fantastic that my mum can make people so happy. And this was, and just to end, a few quotes from the surrogacy children themselves. One child said, well, she was really kind about carrying me in her tummy. Another one said, I think she's kind and she's lovely and funny. And another child said, I feel fine. I don't feel bad or cross in any way. It's just pretty much nature. So I can't do anything about it. I wouldn't like to do anything about it. Thank you. I'll end there. Thank you very much. So what I haven't done is, and we were talking earlier about maybe some of the other work that I might have included, but I didn't. We've now finished a study of gay fathers who've had children through adoption. So if anybody would like me to talk about that, do ask, and I'm happy to do it. We've also been doing some work on single mothers by choice and various other kinds of family types. So yes, so I'm very happy to answer questions on what I've just said or any of the other studies.
I'm happy to hear about the gay parenting. Is anyone else?
Shall I take 5 minutes and just talk about that? Okay, all right. So this was a study that we completed a year or two ago. We were interested in gay fathers and how it worked out for children being raised by two men. So this was a study of adoptive gay fathers. And I should say there's a very good study that's been conducted in the United States by Rachel Farr, Charlotte Patterson, and that research group, who are based partly in the University of Virginia and partly at University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And so they actually published the first study of children raised by gay fathers, looking at the psychological development of the children. And they focused on young children. They were aged, I think, between 1 and 3 years. And generally found that the children were doing very well and they had positive relationships with their parents. So this isn't my study, and I won't go into all the details of it, but I just wanted to say that there actually is a US study as well. That is, if you're interested in this, they've published several papers, and I could send you the references if anyone's interested. So we set out to do a similar study in the UK. We focused on families with slightly older children. So the families we studied had children aged between 4 to 8 years. All of the children had been placed with their adoptive family for at least 1 year at the time we saw them, but generally they'd been there for a bit longer. And most of them had spent, well, on average, they spent about 2 years in, I don't know what you call it here, but we say in care before, in foster care or children's homes, that sort of thing, before being placed with the adoptive family. So, you know, they were all children who had been removed from their birth parents by the state because of abuse or neglect or something like that before they were adopted. So we compared 3 groups of families. So they were all families headed by 2 parents, and I'm just trying to remember the numbers. I think it was 41 gay father families. So these were couples with children aged between 4 to 8 years old. 40 lesbian mother families, also with adopted children aged between 4 to 8 years old, and a group of heterosexual couples, also with adopted children aged between 4 to 8 years old. So they were all adopted families. They were all being raised by couples, and the children were all aged between 4 to 8 years and had been with their family for at least a year. And all of them had, had a very difficult early years, and that was why they were being adopted. So the kinds of measures, the kinds of approach we use are actually quite similar to the approach I was talking about with the surrogacy families. So we use a mixture of in-depth standardized interviews designed to assess quality of parenting. We do observations of parent-child interaction. We have questionnaires administered to parents and also teachers. So it's a kind of, you know, multi-measure, multi-informant approach, quite similar to before. In this study with the observational measure, we used the Etch-a-Sketch with one parent, and then we used a building block task with the other parent and the child. So we used the same coding, but they had to, they were asked to build something together, and we videoed that, and it was coded and so on. So I wasn't expecting to talk about this, so I need to just try and remember exactly what our findings were. But what we found very generally was, when there were differences between the family types, the gay father families came out with more positive scores, so in terms of parenting. Firstly, the gay fathers were less depressed. Now again, this might be to do with not having, mind you, no, it's not to do with pregnancy, because none of them were pregnant, yeah. So it wasn't that. But, I know what I was going to say. It wasn't to do with that, but the others, all of the heterosexual parents and half of the lesbian parents had been through fertility treatment first that hadn't worked. So that was the difference there, whereas the gay fathers often just hadn't expected ever to be able to become parents. So for them, you know, this was seen as something like a bonus and something that was a sort of joy for them, whereas the others wanted very much to have children, but had been through often years of quite distressing fertility treatment. And interesting, that was true of half of the lesbian mothers and not just with the heterosexual couples, which might have, that was why it may have had something to do with the lower levels of depression in the gay father families. So what we found is that in terms of the measures of quality of parenting, that again, where there were differences, the gay father families, in spite of all the concerns that had been raised about gay father families, they actually showed higher scores reflecting more positive parenting. And this was perhaps a bit surprising, but I think the reason is that this was the first cohort of gay fathers to be allowed to adopt children in the UK. So the law had recently changed. The law changed in 2005, and by the time this filtered through the system, so you know it was very recent. And for a lot of the adoption agencies, they were quite apprehensive about placing children with gay fathers. I mean, in some cases there was, you know, generally people just didn't want to do it. In others, they just were worried because it was such unknown territory. So my feeling is that it's possible that I think the gay fathers had, you know, although all adoptive parents are very well screened, but I think they had even greater screening before they were allowed to, you know, be allowed to adopt children. And also, I think that possibly the children with the greatest psychological problems were less likely to be placed with the gay fathers, because again, it was the first cohort, and I think there was a lot of, you know, just people not knowing how this would work out. So I think that might have explained the findings to some extent, because again, where there were different, all of the children had higher levels of problems than the general population, which is what you would expect with children who'd had, you know, these difficulties in their early years. But the children in gay father families had fewer problems at the time of the study than the children in heterosexual and lesbian families. Now, it could be that these gay fathers were just, you know, incredibly wonderful parents, and that was why, or it could be that the children with the greatest difficulties were less likely to be placed with them. But certainly the picture from all of this really contradicted people's worries about, you know, what might happen in a negative way to children raised by gay fathers. So that's where we are with that. We've also been studying children with same-sex parents at school, and this was more qualitative work, looking at any difficulties that they experience with peers and friends at school. And I'll just mention that briefly, because I think, you know, though we find that the gay fathers in our study were very very involved, engaged, committed parents. Children still, you know, in the wider social world, although children are less likely to be teased and bullied than they were 10, 20 years ago, can be difficult for these children, particularly depending on the kind of school environment they go to, where they live geographically, if there are other lesbian and gay parents around, and so on. So we were interested in the children's experiences, and we were commissioned by Stonewall, which is it's a kind of advocacy group for lesbian and gay issues in the United States and the United Kingdom, and we were asked to do this qualitative study. And what we found with the children is that what they found most difficult is constantly having to explain their family, so that, you know, people just constantly ask them, say, you know, it's not possible to have 2 daddies, or it's just, you know, 2 mummies or whatever, and they would constantly have to explain. And then they would sort of explain to everybody, and it would all in their class, and it would all be kind of get that over with, and then they would move to a new class or a new school, and they'd have to start the whole thing over again. So that was one of the things that they you know, found really difficult at school. They felt the teachers should be talking about different kinds of families, and it shouldn't be up to them to explain. They also felt that where there was homophobic bullying, that the teachers didn't react in the same way as they would have to racist bullying. That the teachers, you know, if a racist issue came up, the teachers would be, you know, down on them like a ton of bricks. Is that an English expression? Or
Yeah.
I don't know. But anyway, you know, they would do something immediately. Whereas if it was to do with being in a lesbian or gay family, then the teachers didn't really know what to do. So, and also the children felt that their families weren't represented in the kinds of books and films and, you know, materials they used to learn at school. So these were the kinds of things. So rather than, you know, outright bullying, which does seem to have declined to some extent, it were these more subtle things that the children were saying were problems for them. So I think in terms of, you know, we're hoping to follow up our study of adoptive gay father families as the children enter adolescence. You know, my hunch will be that these will be very well-functioning families, but where children have problems, it's in their wider social world, you know, depending on where they go to school and so on. I'll finally mention a study that is ongoing at the moment. So we're doing a study, which I think some of you know about, but a study of surrogacy, gay father families formed through surrogacy and egg donation. Again, focusing on children aged between 4 to 8 years. And this study we're actually carrying out in the United States because there weren't enough families with older enough children in the United Kingdom. And for me, I'm just sort of very interested in this because it brings together all the different families I've been studying for the last, I don't know how many years, in that they, you know, they're non-traditional in a range of ways because the children have been brought up just by men. The men are gay. There's been assisted reproduction involved, you know, surrogacy and egg donation. So I'm very interested to study these families because it seems to me, I mean, generally the conclusions from our research has been that family structure really doesn't make much of a difference to children. What does matter is the quality of relationships within the families and also the supportiveness of the social environment in which the family is situated. So I'm really interested in this last, maybe my last study, I don't know, I keep saying this, but in this study of gay fathers through surrogacy, because in a way they tick all of the non-traditional boxes together. And I think, you know, depending on what we find, if these children and families are found to be functioning just as well as all the other non-traditional families we've studied, you know, I think it's fairly good evidence that, you know, it's really family relationships that make a difference to children. So we've been doing this work in collaboration with Columbia University in New York, and we are recruiting or hoping to recruit 50 gay father families headed by couples with children aged between, well, 4 to 8, but maybe 3 to 8. Lesbian mother families with children born through donor insemination to control for assisted reproduction, and but we're particularly focusing on the gay father families at the moment. So we're about halfway through in recruitment with these two groups, and I've been speaking today with Karen, who's been very helpful. So if any of you have, know any families who might be interested in taking part, or even just finding out more about the research, then I'd love to hear from you, because we hope to get the study finished within the next 6 months. So, and I would be very happy to come back and talk to you about the findings when we have them. So I think I'll stop there and then open up to questions. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Hi.
Hi. I have a question about the